You can come with me. But remember one thing.
James stopped just before they walked through the entrance of the luxury hotel. For the first time that evening, he looked directly into his wife's eyes. "If anyone speaks to you, don't answer them." Grace forced a small smile and quietly nodded. It wasn't the first time he had said those words. Every time they attended a public event, every family gathering, every business dinner, every celebration, James gave her the same warning. Smile. Quiet. Me do the talking. After years of hearing it, Grace had stopped asking why. She simply believed she wasn't good enough. She believed the problem was her. So earlier that afternoon, while James was getting ready for the biggest night of his career, Grace stood alone in front of a bedroom mirror, whispering the same English greeting over and over again. "Good evening. It's nice to meet you." She stumbled over the words. She tried again, then again. By the time James called for her, she had practiced that single sentence more times than she could remember. Not because she wanted to impress anyone. Not because she wanted attention. She only wanted one thing, to make her husband proud. She never imagined that before the evening was over, the very man she loved would humiliate her so deeply that complete strangers would remember the moment for years. Some lowered their heads because they couldn't bear to watch. Others looked at James in disbelief. No one expected a husband to say what he said next. And no one, not even James himself, could have imagined that the quiet woman he was so desperate to hide would one day become the woman another man would proudly introduce to the world. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Grace. A woman who believed her lack of education made her unworthy of love, until life placed someone in her path who saw her value long before she ever saw it in herself. Grace never spoke another word that night. No one knew where she went, but one thing was certain. The look on her face would haunt everyone who had witnessed it. James tried to carry on with the evening, smiling for photographs, shaking hands, laughing at conversations he wasn't even listening to. Yet no matter how hard he tried to move on, there was one question he couldn't escape. Why? Why would a man be ashamed of the woman who called him her husband? Grace wasn't rude. She wasn't unfaithful. She wasn't demanding. So what was James trying so desperately to hide? Was it the way she spoke, the life she came from, or was there a truth that no one in that room could possibly have imagined? Here's what makes this story so unforgettable. The same woman James couldn't proudly stand beside would one day become the woman another successful man would proudly stand beside in front of the world. How did that happen? What did one man see that the other never could? And how did Grace go from believing she wasn't good enough to becoming the woman everyone admired? The answers aren't where you might expect, because this story doesn't begin at the charity gala. It begins years earlier, with a little girl who never got the chance to sit in a classroom, a promise that changed her life forever, and a man named James who once swore he would never let anyone make her feel less than enough. So, what happened? Let's go back to where it all began. Years before that heartbreaking night at the charity gala, James Walker was a very different man. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't well connected. He was simply a young man working long hours in finance, chasing a dream he refused to give up. Everyone who knew James described him the same way: ambitious, hardworking, and determined to build a life far better than the one he grew up in. He often said that one day, people would know his name. Grace entered his life when neither of them had much to offer except honesty and hope. She had never been given the opportunity to finish school. Life had forced her to choose responsibility over education at a very young age. Although she struggled to speak English fluently, Grace possessed something that couldn't be taught in any classroom. She was kind without expecting anything in return, humble without pretending, and always willing to put someone else's needs before her own. Friends often said she had a way of making people feel seen and valued. James noticed that almost immediately. He didn't fall in love with Grace because of what she had. He fell in love with who she was. He admired her gentle heart, her unwavering loyalty, and the quiet strength she carried through every hardship. When he asked her to marry him, he promised that nothing about her would ever make him ashamed. Grace believed every word. Their families celebrated their marriage. Their friends called them the perfect couple. It seemed as though they were building the kind of life every young couple dreams about. But even in those happy days, there were little moments Grace didn't understand. Whenever she struggled to pronounce a word, James would quickly speak for her. Whenever they met new people, he answered questions before she could. Grace thought he was protecting her. She never imagined he was slowly becoming embarrassed by the very woman he once promised to cherish. Then everything changed. James received a promotion that opened the doors to a world he had spent his entire life trying to enter. James Walker's promotion changed more than his paycheck. Almost overnight, his world became everything he had once dreamed about. The long hours finally paid off. His salary nearly doubled. He moved Grace into a luxury apartment overlooking the city, and his calendar quickly filled with executive meetings, networking events, and private dinners with people he used to admire from a distance. He bought tailored suits, drove a nicer car, and surrounded himself with influential friends who talked about success as if it were the only thing that mattered. Grace celebrated every milestone with genuine happiness. She proudly told her family that James deserved every blessing because no one had worked harder than he had. She believed his success belonged to both of them. But little by little, James began to change. The compliments disappeared. Instead, he started noticing things he had never complained about before. He criticized the way Grace dressed, saying she looked too simple for the people he now associated with. He corrected the way she spoke, sometimes before she could even finish a sentence. If she mispronounced an English word, he would sigh with frustration instead of offering encouragement. Grace laughed it off at first, convincing herself he was only trying to help her fit into his new world. So she practiced harder. She watched English lessons online, read children's books aloud when James wasn't home, and stood in front of the mirror repeating simple greetings, hoping that one day he would look at her with pride again. But no matter how hard Grace tried, it was never enough. The more successful James became, the more distant he grew. At business events, he introduced colleagues, clients, and even people he had met only once. Yet somehow, the woman standing beside him was often left without an introduction. Grace noticed it every time, but she never confronted him. She kept telling herself that things would get better once the pressure at work settled down. She was wrong. The promotion James had always dreamed of didn't bring them closer. It quietly became the beginning of the moment that would destroy everything they had built together. And that moment arrived with an invitation to an elegant charity dinner that neither of them would ever forget. A few weeks later, James received an invitation to one of the most important corporate charity dinners of his career. The guest list included executives from major financial firms, respected investors, elected officials, and influential business leaders from across the state. To James, this wasn't just another dinner. It was an opportunity to strengthen relationships that could shape his future. Grace was genuinely excited for him. She carefully ironed James's suit, helped him straighten his tie, and spent nearly an hour deciding which dress to wear. Before they left, she stood in front of the mirror one last time, quietly practicing the same greeting she had been repeating for days. She smiled to herself, hoping that maybe, just maybe, James would finally be proud to have her standing beside him. As they arrived, James gave her the familiar reminder she had heard so many times before. Just smile, and let me do the talking. Grace nodded without saying a word. Inside, James greeted one important guest after another. Grace remained close to him, smiling politely whenever someone looked her way. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then, during a conversation with several executives and investors, one elderly businessman looked at Grace, smiled warmly, and asked the simplest question of the evening. "So, how long have you two been married?" James froze. Glanced around at the people standing nearby, forced a nervous laugh, and answered without looking at Grace. "I usually come alone." Smiles disappeared. No one laughed. The silence that followed was heavier than anyone expected. Grace stood perfectly still. She felt every pair of eyes turned toward her, but she couldn't bring herself to look up. Without saying a word, she quietly stepped away from the group. James continued the conversation as though nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had already changed. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unable to understand why any husband would distance himself from the woman standing beside him. The drive home was painfully quiet. James kept his eyes on the road. Grace kept hers on the window. Neither of them spoke a single word. The next morning, before James left for work, Grace sat alone at the edge of their bed. She looked down at the wedding ring she had worn with so much pride since the day James slipped it onto her finger. Slowly, she took it off and held it tightly in the palm of her hand. For the first time, she wondered if she truly belonged in her husband's life. But despite the heartbreak, Grace wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. After that dinner, something inside James Walker seemed to change completely. The distance between them grew with every passing week. Invitations to business events kept arriving, but Grace was no longer asked to come along. Whenever there was a company celebration or a dinner with clients, James found an excuse to leave her at home. If friends suggested taking a group photo, he would somehow position himself where Grace wasn't standing beside him. At first, she convinced herself he was simply busy. But as the months passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The criticism also became more frequent. James complained about the way Grace dressed, telling her she looked too plain. He corrected the way she spoke even when she hadn't made a mistake. If she tried to join a conversation, he interrupted her before she could finish. Sometimes he laughed about her poor English in front of other people, brushing it off as harmless humor. Everyone else laughed politely, but Grace always smiled through the pain, pretending the jokes didn't hurt. Each time she looked in the mirror, she became less certain of the woman looking back at her. The confidence she had once carried so naturally slowly disappeared, replaced by constant fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. Their friends began noticing that Grace wasn't herself anymore. The cheerful woman who used to brighten every room had become unusually quiet. Even her family asked if everything was all right, but before Grace could answer, James always stepped in with the same explanation. She's just too sensitive. People believed him. Grace almost believed him too. Then one evening, after another uncomfortable argument at home, Grace gathered enough courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her heart for months. "James, are you ashamed of me?" He didn't hesitate. He looked directly at her and said the words she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You embarrass me." Grace stood frozen. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. In that moment, she realized the man who had once promised to protect her had become the very person breaking her spirit. And within a few short weeks, Grace was gone. Grace didn't slam the door. She didn't leave a letter filled with anger. She didn't post her pain on social media or try to turn friends and family against James Walker. One morning, after he left for work, she quietly packed a small suitcase, placed her wedding ring inside a drawer, and walked out of the apartment with little more than a few clothes and the determination to find herself again. The first few weeks were the hardest. She rented a small apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't luxurious, but for the first time in years, it felt peaceful. There were no harsh words waiting for her when she came home. No one telling her to stay quiet. No one making her feel like she wasn't enough. Grace knew the years of criticism had left scars that couldn't be seen, so she made a decision she had never imagined making. She asked for help. Week after week, she attended therapy, slowly learning that her worth had never been measured by how well she spoke English or how much education she had received. She also enrolled in adult education classes, determined to learn the things life had once denied her. Every new word she mastered, every sentence she spoke with confidence, reminded her that it was never too late to grow. But Grace wasn't trying to become someone else. She was finally becoming the woman she had always been afraid to believe she could be. She found a part-time job, learned new skills, and spent her weekends volunteering at a local community center, helping families who were struggling just as hers once had. The more she encouraged others, the more her own confidence returned. People were drawn to her kindness, her patience, and the quiet strength she carried without asking for recognition. Meanwhile, James heard bits and pieces about Grace through mutual friends. He laughed. He convinced himself she wouldn't last on her own. He believed she would eventually call, apologize, and ask to come back. He couldn't have been more wrong. Because while James was busy underestimating the woman he had lost, someone extraordinary was about to notice everything he had failed to see. A few months later, the same community center where Grace volunteered organized a charity fundraiser for families in need. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She spent the evening welcoming guests, serving meals, and making sure everyone felt comfortable. She had no idea that one of the evening's biggest donors was a man named Ethan Brooks, a respected entrepreneur known not only for building a successful business, but also for quietly supporting causes that changed people's lives. People admired Ethan because success had never changed the way he treated others. He greeted everyone with the same respect, whether they were executives, volunteers, or complete strangers. Their first conversation lasted only a few minutes, but Ethan noticed something most people overlooked. He noticed that Grace listened before she spoke. He noticed her genuine kindness toward people who could offer her nothing in return. When she paused to find the right English words, he didn't interrupt or finish her sentences. He waited patiently, smiling as she expressed herself in her own way. Instead of focusing on what she struggled with, Ethan saw the wisdom in her thoughts, the compassion in her heart, and the quiet strength she had built through years of hardship. After that evening, their paths crossed again through volunteer projects. They talked more, laughed more, and slowly became close friends. Grace never told Ethan everything about her past at once, and he never pressured her to. He simply gave her something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: respect. As time passed, friendship quietly grew into something deeper. Ethan never tried to change Grace because he never believed she needed fixing. He admired the woman she had always been, her humility, her courage, her generosity, and her unwavering heart. For the first time in years, Grace no longer questioned whether she was enough. She finally understood that the problem had never been who she was. It had been how one person chose to see her. And just when life seemed to have given Grace a beautiful new beginning, fate arranged a reunion that no one saw coming. Almost 2 years after the night that changed everything, another charity gala brought many of the city's most influential business leaders together once again. The venue looked just as elegant, the guest list was just as impressive, and many of the same executives, investors, and public officials were there. James Walker arrived with the confidence that had become part of his public image. He greeted familiar faces, exchanged handshakes, and spoke about new business opportunities. He never imagined the evening was about to confront him with the one person he had spent months trying to forget. Then the room grew unusually quiet. James turned toward the entrance. Standing there was Grace. She wasn't trying to attract attention. She wasn't wearing the most expensive dress in the room, but there was something about her that everyone noticed immediately. She carried herself with a confidence that had never been there before. The fear that once filled her eyes had been replaced with peace, and the woman who used to hide behind silence now smiled with genuine happiness. Beside her stood Ethan Brooks. He greeted guests warmly, never once letting go of Grace's hand. As they made their way through the reception, several people stopped to welcome them. Then one well-known investor smiled and looked at Grace. "And who is this beautiful woman?" Without the slightest hesitation, Ethan smiled proudly. "My wife." Then, looking at Grace with unmistakable admiration, he added, "She's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Conversation stopped. Several guests remembered another charity gala years earlier. Another question. Another answer. James remembered it too. He stood frozen as he watched Ethan do so effortlessly what he had never been willing to do himself: honor the woman who had once begged for nothing more than to stand proudly beside her husband. For the first time, James wasn't thinking about his career, his reputation, or the people around him. He was thinking about Grace. He finally saw the value he had spent years overlooking. He finally understood that the woman he had tried so hard to hide had never been the problem. The problem had been the man who couldn't see her worth. But as painful as that realization was, the biggest surprise of the night was still waiting for him. The reunion stayed with James Walker long after the gala ended. For days, he couldn't stop thinking about Grace. The image of Ethan Brooks proudly introducing her as his wife played over and over in his mind. It was the same question, in the same city, at another charity gala. Yet this time, the answer was completely different. For the first time in years, James saw what everyone else had seen all along. Grace hadn't been the one who needed to change. A week later, James finally gathered the courage to call her. Grace agreed to meet him at a quiet coffee shop. When she arrived, there was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, no desire to make him feel the pain he had caused her. She simply greeted him politely and took her seat. James struggled to find the right words. "Made the biggest mistake of my life," he admitted. "I let success change me. I cared too much about what people thought. I was under pressure. I was immature. And I took it out on the one person who loved me the most." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then James looked at Grace and quietly asked the question he had rehearsed 100 times. "Do you think we could ever start over?" Grace looked at him with compassion, the same compassion she had shown him years before. Then she smiled gently and said the words James would never forget. "You were ashamed of the woman I was." She paused for a moment before continuing. "He was proud of the woman you couldn't see." James lowered his head. There was nothing left to say. Grace stood up, sincerely wished him peace, and thanked him for the good memories they had once shared. Then she turned and walked away, not with anger, not with resentment, not to prove a point. She walked away because she no longer needed James's approval to know her worth. Sometimes the greatest loss in life isn't losing someone. It's discovering their true value only after someone else has loved, respected, and cherished them the way they deserved all along. Grace's story reminds us that not every broken relationship ends because love disappears. Sometimes it ends because respect slowly fades away. James Walker didn't lose Grace in a single moment. He lost her one careless word at a time, one public embarrassment at a time, one silent dismissal at a time. By the time he realized what she truly meant to him, someone else had already given her what she had longed for throughout her marriage. Not wealth, not luxury, and not perfection, but love, respect, and the freedom to be herself. Ethan Brooks never loved Grace because she spoke perfect English. He never measured her worth by the schools she attended or the circles she moved in. He saw what James failed to see from the very beginning: a woman with a kind heart, quiet strength, unwavering loyalty, and a spirit that refused to give up, even after years of being made to feel invisible. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. The people who truly deserve a place in your life will never make you feel small just because you don't have what the world celebrates. They will recognize your character long before they notice your imperfections. And sometimes, the greatest regret a person carries isn't losing success. It's realizing they threw away someone who would have stood beside them through every season of life. Now we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think James truly loved Grace? Or was he only in love with the status he believed success could bring? If you were in Grace's position, would you have forgiven James and given him another chance? And at what exact moment do you think James realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all, and we'd love to know what you think. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. And if you think Grace's journey was emotional, wait until you hear the next story. About a husband who abandoned his wife because she couldn't have children, only to discover a truth that changed his life forever. You won't want to miss it.